The Whispering Barn. We'd been living in Kansas City for years, surviving on odd jobs and the type of work that never lets you truly breathe. When the opportunity to buy a cheap, abandoned farm came up, Emily and I didn't think twice. Felt like the fresh start we needed. The house was old but sturdy, and the land stretched wide, painted in shades of gold and dusty brown. But it was the barn, with its chipped red paint and towering gabled roof, that really caught my eye. It was imposing, even beautiful. Yet, from the moment I saw it, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was waiting for us. The first few days passed peacefully. Emily unpacked boxes and hung up new curtains, while I tackled minor repairs. We'd wake up to bright sunlight filtering through our bedroom window and fall asleep to crickets chirping outside, feeling that rare calm that comes from solitude. Then, on our fourth night, I heard it. Around 3 a.m., this strange clanking sound echoed from the barn. I tried to brush it off. Maybe the old structure was shifting in the night. But when the sound continued night after night, it became harder to ignore. It was like the rattling of chains, followed by a faint, muffled whisper that drifted through the walls of our bedroom. Emily noticed it too, and I saw a flash of unease cross her face every time it happened. "Jack," she whispered one night, clinging to my arm. "It sounds like someone's in pain." Reluctantly, I grabbed a flashlight, pulled on my boots, and headed out to the barn. The night was still, not a hint of wind to explain the noises. When I stepped inside, the air was thick, musty. Dust particles swirled in the thin beam of my flashlight. The sound had stopped, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Over the next few nights, things only got worse. The whispers grew louder, as though multiple voices were crowding in, rising and falling in desperation. Emily had started to look haggard, her face drawn and pale. We'd both been losing sleep, our nerves stretched thin. One night, when the sounds grew too intense to ignore, Emily sat up, trembling, and told me about the history of the place. A neighbor had mentioned that in the 1800s, the farm had supposedly served as a stop on the Underground Railroad, a refuge for escaping slaves. "But Jack," she whispered, eyes wide, "they say the owner, a cruel man named Silas Hawthorne, betrayed those he was supposed to protect. He'd lock them in the barn and hand them over to hunters for a reward." That revelation chilled me to my core, but it explained a lot. We decided to perform a night vigil inside the barn to confront whatever had taken root there. We took blankets, a lantern, and 2 thermoses of coffee, and waited. The barn was silent at first, just the creaks and groans of an aging structure settling into the night. Then, as the clock struck 3, a bone-chilling sound filled the air, the metallic rattle of chains, louder than ever before. Emily gripped my hand so tightly I felt her nails dig into my skin. I tried to stay calm, but the sound was overwhelming. The whispers started up, faint at first, like a gust of wind. Then they grew clearer, each voice pleading, begging, crying for release. Suddenly, the barn door slammed shut behind us with a deafening crash. I rushed over, trying to open it, but it was like an invisible force held it shut. The whispers grew louder, circling us, wrapping around us like a suffocating fog. Emily screamed as a cold hand brushed her arm, and I swung the flashlight around, finding nothing but darkness. Then I heard it. Among the whispers, a voice distinctly called my name. "Jack." It was drawn out, stretched, like something savoring my fear. I felt a sharp, cold pressure on my shoulder, and everything went black. When I opened my eyes, the barn was drenched in the gray light of dawn. I was lying on the floor, alone. Emily was crumpled nearby, unconscious but alive. I shook her awake, feeling a gnawing terror at the pit of my stomach. "Where's Jack?" she asked in a slurred, confused whisper. I swallowed hard, gripping her hand. "I'm here, But then I realized she wasn't looking at me. Her gaze was fixed on something just beyond my shoulder, as though she were looking through me, searching for someone else. In that hollow, quiet moment, I felt wrong, like I was on the outside looking in, as if I was no longer a part of the world I knew. After that night, I became a ghost in her life. Every night since, around 3 a.m., she hears the whispers, and among them, she hears my voice. She still calls out to me, trying to find me. Second story, the Midnight Harvest. Growing up on the Sawyer family farm in rural Virginia, my brother Luke and I were always told our land was blessed. No matter how bad the season or how little rain we got, our fields yielded abundant crops year after year. The townsfolk would eye our fields with envy, sometimes crossing themselves as they drove by. Dad never said much about it, just that we owed our fortune to the hard work of our ancestors, especially our great-grandfather. When our parents passed in a car accident last year, Luke and I inherited the property. Luke wasn't keen on farming, but I'd always loved the land, so I decided to take it over myself. Something about the place felt like it needed me to be there, and for months I ran it just like my father had, following every tradition he'd taught us. But there was one thing he'd never shown us, something hidden in the attic, a dusty journal bound in worn leather, tucked beneath a loose floorboard. It belonged to my great-grandfather Joseph, an immigrant who'd settled here in the early 1900s. His handwriting was rough, faded with age, and as I flipped through the brittle pages, I started to notice some troubling passages written in his shaky script. He wrote about a figure he called the Man in the Shadows. According to the entries, Joseph had made a harvest pact with this being soon after he arrived. In return for abundant crops, our family would be bound to give something back to the land, to feed it. Every generation. My stomach twisted as I read. It sounded like the ramblings of a madman, but as I thought about our land's unnatural fertility, a chill settled over me. Desperate to believe it was just family folklore, I dug deeper, trying to uncover some other explanation. But no matter how hard I searched, I found more questions than answers. Then the whispers started. At first, it was subtle. When I'd be out alone at dusk, checking the irrigation or pulling up weeds, I'd hear faint murmurs, like low voices on the wind, impossible to place. I figured it was just exhaustion, but the more I tried to push it from my mind, the louder they grew. They seemed to echo from the ground itself, words I couldn't make out, yet filled with a strange urgency. One night, I decided to confront my fears head-on. I took a lantern and went to the far side of the property, where the oldest fields lay, the ones my great-grandfather had planted when he first arrived. As I walked, the lantern flickered, casting shadows that twisted and danced around me. I felt something watching, something I couldn't see, a presence that felt ancient and hungry. Then, as I approached the oldest tree on the property, I felt it, a cold, suffocating pressure in the air, making it hard to breathe. I froze, unable to move, as a figure began to take shape just beyond the glow of the lantern. Tall and shadowed, its eyes glinted with a cold, unnatural light, and I felt it smiling at me, as if mocking my disbelief. Without thinking, I backed away and sprinted home, my heart pounding like a hammer. When I finally stumbled through the door, Luke was there, and I could tell by the look on his face that he knew something was wrong. I didn't tell him everything, just enough to warn him that the land wasn't what we thought it was. In the following days, the fields began to change. Blights appeared overnight, withering plants that had always grown strong. No matter what treatments I tried, they spread, creeping through every crop. Luke said it was probably just a bad season, but deep down, I knew it was because of me. I hadn't honored the pact. One evening, driven by desperation, I returned to Joseph's journal, flipping through until I found his final entry. He wrote about his own pact, his fear, his regret, and his final act of feeding the land. It didn't mention how, but the words hinted at something dark, an unspoken ritual he'd carried out alone, something only he and the Man in the Shadows knew. I decided then and there to leave. I packed my things and told Luke I couldn't stay on this cursed land another night. I didn't care what happened to the crops or the harvest. I'd rather abandon the farm than give in to whatever sinister force lurked beneath it. That night, I grabbed my bags, threw them in my truck, and took one last look at the fields under the silver light of the full moon. It was so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat. Then, just as I was about to get in, I felt a chilling presence. Closer this time, almost beside me. I turned, and there he was. The man in the shadows stood in the middle of the field, dark and still, his shape barely outlined against the dim sky. His eyes met mine, and for a moment, I was paralyzed by a terror I can't put into words. I felt as though he was peeling back every layer of my soul, seeing everything I feared. Then, before I could move, he raised one long, bony hand and pointed to the ground beneath my feet. I don't remember much after that. I remember running, the sound of my footsteps, my own heavy breathing. I remember Luke shouting as he ran to the door, reaching for me. Then darkness. The next morning, Luke found my truck still idling in the driveway, door open and engine humming. But I was gone, vanished without a trace. There was no sign of a struggle, no footprints, just silence. Months later, after Luke finally sold the farm, he returned to visit. Where I'd last stood, a strange new tree had taken root, growing faster than anything he'd ever seen. Its bark was rough and blackened, its leaves dark as midnight, twisting upward as if reaching for the sky. And beneath its roots, the whispers continued, the murmurs of the land, the calls of a pact that could never be broken. Third story, the Scarecrow of Winchester. When my grandfather passed, I inherited his farm in Winchester, Illinois, a small, close-knit town where tradition is taken seriously, especially during autumn. Every October, the townsfolk put up scarecrows on their farms, a long-standing tradition they call the Fall Watch. Local legend says these scarecrows are meant to ward off spirits that come with the changing season. I'd visited the farm as a kid but hadn't returned in years, so I only had faint memories of Grandpa's scarecrow. I remember it being strange, something that made you feel watched even during the day. Grandpa's scarecrow was still there when I arrived. It stood at the far edge of the cornfield, slumped over and disheveled from years of neglect, wearing Grandpa's old overalls and flannel shirt, stuffed with straw that poked out at odd angles. Its face was a burlap sack, twisted into a knot where its mouth should have been. Its eyes were painted dark, nearly black, and it had the faintest, cruel smile carved in red paint. The sight of it was eerie, almost as if it was watching, even from a distance. But it was just an old scarecrow, right? This October was my first season as the farm's caretaker, and I felt the pressure to continue the tradition. I wanted to keep the townspeople on my side, especially since they all expected me to replace that creepy old scarecrow. So one afternoon, I took it down and tossed it aside, deciding to build a new one from scratch. The new scarecrow I made was simple, nothing like Grandpa's. I gave it a face with large button eyes and a crude smile, more friendly than ominous. Proud of my work, I drove the wooden post deep into the field and secured the new scarecrow in place. That evening, as the sun set, I watched it stand tall against the twilight. I felt accomplished, thinking maybe I'd finally put an old, unsettling memory to rest. That night, however, I couldn't shake a sense of unease. Around midnight, I woke up to a soft rustling outside my window. It sounded like footsteps, shuffling and slow, moving along the gravel around the house. I tried to convince myself it was a raccoon or maybe just the wind stirring up the fields. But the sounds persisted, slow and methodical, circling the house like someone or something was pacing around. The next morning, I went outside to inspect, half expecting to see animal tracks. But what I found were human-sized footprints in the mud, leading from the field directly to my front porch and back again. They were muddy, almost as if they'd come from the creek out back, though no one should have been out there. And then I saw the new scarecrow. It was standing off-center, tilted slightly to the left, as if it had been moved from where I'd secured it the day before. I went over and tried to shift it back, only to find the post still lodged firmly in the ground. Uneasy, I tried brushing it off as my imagination, but the uneasiness lingered. A few nights later, I was cleaning out the attic when I found Grandpa's old journal, wedged between a dusty box of tools and a coil of rope. I wasn't one for reading diaries, but something compelled me to open it. Inside, I found pages of careful handwriting documenting farm work, local gossip, and details about the scarecrow. One entry stood out, dated almost 30 years ago, about the very scarecrow I'd taken down. The scarecrow must stay put. Built him right, tied him down, and made sure he won't leave. Old legends say he holds it down, binds it to the earth. Keep him in his place or else it might get out. The words gave me chills. Grandpa had always been the practical type, but these notes sounded like the ramblings of someone deeply afraid. I skimmed more entries, and each year around October, there were notes about keeping it tied down, warding it off, and never replacing it. I felt a chill creep down my spine as I looked out into the night. From my window, I could see the scarecrow, my new one, standing in the field, slouched but watching, somehow watching. Ignoring the warnings in the journal, I couldn't let go of my decision to keep my new scarecrow up. So I tore up Grandpa's old scarecrow the next day, thinking it was just an object, nothing more. But that night, the sounds returned, louder and more deliberate. Heavy, dragging footsteps trailed around the house, then onto the porch, and I could have sworn I heard scratching against the doorframe. Heart racing, I ran to the door and threw it open, hoping to scare off whoever, or whatever, was out there. But all I found was silence and an unsettling stillness in the air. Just as I turned to go back inside, I noticed it. A small mound of straw, lying in the middle of the porch, mixed with damp mud. The following night, I could hardly sleep. I lay awake, listening to the soft scratching sounds, growing bolder with every passing hour, until I couldn't bear it anymore. At 3 a.m., I grabbed a flashlight and went outside, determined to put an end to whatever prank was tormenting me. I shined the light over the fields, my hands trembling, the beam slicing through the thick darkness. When the light caught the scarecrow, I froze. It wasn't where I'd placed it. Instead, it stood at the edge of the field, head cocked toward the house, arms drooping at odd angles, as though it were stretching out, reaching for something. For me, panicking, I tore it down right then and there, ripping it apart piece by piece, scattering the straw until nothing remained. It was over, I told myself. Whatever haunted the farm had to be done with me now. But the next morning, when I opened the door to go out, I stopped dead in my tracks. There, propped on the porch, was a figure, a scarecrow, but different. It had no head, only a twisted burlap sack where the face should have been, and it was dressed in clothes that looked familiar, down to the tattered shirt and overalls. They were Grandpa's. My vision blurred as I backed away, unable to breathe, every nerve in my body screaming to run. I don't remember much else of that day, only that they found me hours later, sitting in the middle of the field, unresponsive, as if something had drained me of everything I was. And now the farm has a new scarecrow. This one's different, though. It stands where the old one used to be, head tilted toward the house, clothed in an outfit that looks strangely like the one I was last seen wearing. Fourth story, the dirt road lights. I grew up in rural North Carolina, surrounded by dense woods, miles from the nearest town, in a place where every sound, every shadow seemed magnified. Our home, the Miller family farmhouse, sat at the end of a long, narrow dirt road that wound through thick forest. It was an old house, weathered by generations and filled with creaks and drafts that unsettled even the hardiest of visitors. My parents used to tell us stories about the land, tales meant to keep us from wandering too far, especially at night. But nothing they said ever scared me half as much as the stories people told about the lights. The story went like this. In the 1940s, a truck driver got caught on our road during a storm. He'd been hauling something up from South Carolina when his truck broke down right outside our property. Some locals say he walked up to the house to ask for help. Others say he never made it out of his truck. The next morning, only tire tracks and a broken-down cab were found. No sign of the driver. His disappearance was filed as a mystery, but locals said his ghost lingered on that road, forever searching for help that would never come. I never believed any of it, at least not until the summer I turned 16. It was a hot July evening, and I was lying on the roof, watching the sky fade to black. I had almost drifted off when a glimmer down by the road caught my eye. At first, I thought it was just headlights from a passing car, but as I sat up, I realized there was something strange about them. They didn't move. 2 yellow lights, just sitting there, hovering like eyes at the far end of the dirt road. Curiosity got the better of me, and I grabbed my binoculars. The lights seemed to be positioned at the height of a truck, but the outline around them was indistinct. I watched, waiting for the lights to turn or move, but they stayed there for almost an hour before fading into the night. When I mentioned it to my parents the next morning, they exchanged a wary glance. My mom muttered something about how we don't speak of the lights, and my dad just shook his head. Old tales, he said, but I could see the unease in his eyes. Every night after that, I couldn't help but check the end of the road, and like clockwork, those 2 yellow lights would appear just around midnight. Some nights, they'd hover in the same spot. Other nights, they'd edge closer, inching down the road like they were coming straight for the house. By August, the lights had become a nightly ritual. Some nights, they'd disappear altogether, but the next night, they'd be back, closer than before. It was a Friday, a night when the air was thick with an impending storm, when I finally decided I had to know. I had to see what those lights were. Around midnight, I grabbed a flashlight and threw on my coat. I could hear the distant rumble of thunder as I slipped out the door and started toward the end of the road. The rain began to pour, making it hard to see, and every step felt like the mud was trying to pull me back. But I pushed on, guided by the faint glow ahead. The lights were closer than ever, just 100 yards from the house. As I got near, they flickered, like they knew I was watching. And then, just like that, they disappeared. I froze, shining my flashlight around, but there was nothing, just an empty, muddy road stretching into the dark. The silence was so thick I could hear my own heartbeat. But then, I heard a sound that didn't belong. A low, rumbling engine noise, faint but steady, somewhere behind me. My stomach dropped as I realized it was coming from the direction of the house. Panicked, I started running, slipping in the mud as I made my way back. The engine sound grew louder, closer, like it was following me, but no matter how much I turned, I couldn't see any lights. By the time I reached the front porch, the sound had vanished, leaving only the patter of rain and the relentless roll of thunder. The next morning, when I told my parents what had happened, they looked at me like I'd lost my mind. But I knew what I'd heard, and the evidence was there, plain as day. 2 tire marks, deep in the mud, led straight to our front steps. I ran back inside, my skin crawling. By noon, I noticed something else that made my blood run cold. My coat, the one I'd worn the night before, was gone. Nowhere in the house, not even on the porch. My parents insisted I just dropped it, but I knew I'd come back with it on. The following days were a blur. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching, waiting. The lights stopped appearing after that night, but every now and then, I'd hear that faint engine hum off in the distance, like it was circling, just beyond the tree line. 3 months later, I heard from a friend that another driver had seen the lights on the road, right near our property. And every sighting seemed to get closer to our house, like whatever it was had unfinished business with our family. 5th story, the echo of the earth. After my divorce, I needed a fresh start, somewhere quiet to help Sarah and me find some peace. The old farm in Oregon felt perfect, isolated, picturesque, and just the right size for us. I thought that maybe, In the wide open fields and old farmhouse, we'd finally find the space to heal. Sarah, my 4-year-old, was immediately smitten with the place, especially the sprawling fields that stretched as far as the eye could see. The first couple of weeks were peaceful. Sarah spent her afternoons running through the fields, laughing and playing with the wildflowers. I'd sit on the porch and watch her, feeling a strange calm settle in for the first time in months. The isolation was comforting, the quiet soothing. But then the noises began. The first time I heard it, I thought it was just Sarah calling from the field. I was unpacking boxes in the kitchen when I heard her faint voice calling, "Mommy?" I wiped my hands and headed outside, expecting to see her waving from somewhere. But she was right by the porch, tugging at her shoelace. "Did you call me, honey?" I asked. She looked up at me, confused. "No, Mommy." I tried to laugh it off, chalking it up to the sounds of the wind or maybe an echo from her play. But it didn't stop. Every few days, I'd hear it, her small, soft voice calling from somewhere in the fields or the nearby woods, only to find Sarah completely unaware. The sound always seemed to drift up from the ground, faint but unmistakable, like her voice was coming from beneath the soil. One evening, I sat Sarah down at the dinner table, and out of nowhere, she asked, "Mommy, why does the ground talk?" My heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean, sweetie?" She shrugged, her big eyes innocent but serious. "Sometimes I hear people talking in the dirt. They sound sad." She went back to her dinner as if she'd just mentioned the weather. I didn't know what to say. I tried to play it off, but I couldn't shake the dread that settled over me. That night, I found myself unable to sleep. The silence of the countryside was suddenly too loud, pressing in on me. I decided to go through some of the old records I'd found in the farmhouse attic, hoping to distract myself. In a dusty box labeled Steinbeck property, I found clippings and documents dating back nearly a century. Then, a newspaper article from the 1950s caught my eye. "Local family disappears without a trace." The article described the family who had lived here, parents and 3 children. They'd vanished in the middle of the night, leaving the house unlocked, their belongings scattered as if they'd intended to come right back. But they never did. Neighbors claimed to have heard strange noises from the field, but the family was never found. My stomach turned as I read, and a sense of unease wrapped around me like cold fingers. I shut the box, telling myself it was just a creepy old story and nothing more. But the next day, I heard it again. I was in the kitchen, glancing out the window to check on Sarah, who was picking flowers by the edge of the field. Then I heard her voice, clear as day, whispering, "Mommy?" It sounded different this time, closer, more desperate, as if she were right beneath the floorboards. Panicking, I ran outside. Sarah looked up at me, surprised, as I called her name. "Are you okay, Mommy?" she asked, her face innocent and full of concern. I forced a smile, nodding, but inside I was shaking. That night, I locked all the doors and kept Sarah close, wondering if I was going mad. Days went by without incident, but the silence felt charged, like the house was holding its breath. Then, one late afternoon, I went inside for just a moment to grab a glass of water. When I returned, Sarah was gone. I called her name, my voice breaking as I scanned the field. Nothing, just an endless, empty landscape. "Sarah!" I screamed, my heart pounding. And then, softly, faintly, I heard her voice call back, "Mommy?" But it wasn't coming from the field. It sounded like it was coming from below, from somewhere deep in the earth. I ran, frantically searching for her, my voice hoarse from screaming her name. I don't remember how long I wandered before I stumbled across a rotted trapdoor hidden behind the old barn, half buried beneath weeds and dirt. With trembling hands, I forced it open, the smell of damp earth and something stale wafting up. I climbed down into the dark. The small basement was empty except for one thing: handprints. Tiny handprints coated the walls, pressed into the dust as if dozens of children had been trapped down there, reaching out. I stood frozen, my flashlight flickering as the walls seemed to close in. And then I heard her again. Sarah's voice, echoing from somewhere deeper within, as if the earth itself was mimicking her. Desperate, I called her name, but only her voice answered, repeating my words in a twisted, sorrowful echo. Mommy, Mommy, where are you? Days passed in a blur after that. Search parties came, locals gathered, but no one found Sarah. I became a fixture in those fields, wandering every day, calling her name, convinced she was still out there somewhere. People say they hear me at all hours, that my voice carries across the fields. And some claim they hear her too, her small voice drifting up from the ground, echoing mine. Now, they say, the fields have two voices, the sound of a mother and daughter calling to each other, forever lost in the echo of the earth.